For joining us today. We're going to get started in about a minute or so, but we're going to let folks file in. We've got over almost 100 people already in the room, so that sounds great. We're going to be with you in just 1 minute. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to give you about 15 seconds more for folks to file in. Over 100 people are joining us today, and we're excited about that for the legislative breakdown. And me, Ben Olsen, and Sarah Mooradian will be with you in just 1 minute. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Klemz, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, or MCEA. MCEA is a 51-year-old organization. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. We do nonprofit law. We work at the legislature. We work in regulatory agencies using law and science to protect Minnesota's natural resources, environment, and the health of its people. We work on all the major environmental issues in the state, including energy and climate change, sulfide mining, pipelines, and we're dedicated to protecting and enforcing our environmental laws. And just so you know, MCA is a nonprofit, and half of our funding comes from individuals just like you. So if you learned something useful today, please consider making a gift. There's a link in the chat. Nonprofits need your help more than ever. There are more challenges to our funding and more work to do than we've ever seen. So we're really grateful for your support. Thank you for helping us out. So why are we doing this webinar? Well, when we started planning this, to be honest, we thought this would be a breakdown in the sense that we would break down what happened at the Minnesota legislature this year, as in kind of, well, here's what happened, right? Well, now it looks like we may be more in a breakdown in the sense that things have broken down. Things are not done on time. There are unresolved issues. It's really not too surprising considering we're ending here, considering how the session started and how evenly divided the Minnesota legislature is right now. But we're going to try to cover some of the things that are happening right now. So to give you a quick roadmap, we're going to cover some of the state of play at the legislature right now, what's happened so far on environmental and climate issues this legislative session, and also look a little bit about how the federal government and the new administration has intersected with it before opening up to questions that you might have for the last 15 or so minutes. So please put your questions, if you've got them, in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at that time. But I'm going to start by introducing our two panelists, and they are Ben Olsen and Sarah Mooradian. And I'll start with Sarah. Sarah is someone we work with a lot of the legislature, MCEA does, working on a lot of the same issues, and I'm excited to have her here today. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this work, Sarah, as well as one word you'd use to describe this past legislative session.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Happy to be here today. So, my background is in environmental law and policy, and I really believe that effective legal advocacy starts at the legislature, where laws are being made, amended, and repealed. So, this kind of work is right up my alley. I started at CURE about 3.5 years ago, and at that point, my work covered pretty much everything, anything law and policy related. So, whether that was at the Public Utilities Commission, or another state agency, or townships or local county boards, or even the legislature. But as CURE has grown, I've really been able to focus in on the legislature, which is really great. I think the word I would use to describe this session is dysfunctional. We got off to a rocky start with the election results, of course, but even after that was resolved, things didn't go very smoothly. We got really short notice on bill hearings, which was hard as advocates to prepare for. There was a shortened calendar in the House, which meant fewer bills being heard generally. And then there were also some noticeable dissension amongst the DFLers in the Senate on energy bills. And not to get too ahead of ourselves here, obviously, but we're now in this weird interim period after the end of regular session, but before special session is called.
I wonder if you talk a little bit about CURE, where you work.
Yeah, absolutely. So CURE is a rurally based nonprofit dedicated to protecting and restoring resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of the people who care about them. Our office is out in Montevideo, which is about 2.5 hours straight west of the cities. And historically, we were focused on local organizing around water quality in the Minnesota River, since our office is right by the headwaters. But we've really expanded our scope over the last couple decades to tackle all sorts of environmental and energy issues that are important to rural people and places.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And it's really great to have you on today. Um, well, I'll turn over to Ben real quick. Ben Olsen is our legislative director at MCEA, and this was your first session working as legislative director at MCEA. So tell us a little bit about your previous experience and why you came to MCEA.
Great to be with you, Sarah and Aaron. Ben Olsen, Legislative Director for MCEA. I worked 11 sessions at the legislature as a lobbyist, focused on everything from health and human services, economic development, chemical regulation, product stewardship. And then I took a little break from lobbying and for the past 5 years worked at the University of Southern California in advancement communications, focused on the president of the University of Southern California's sustainability moonshot, which included everything from investing in the next generation of battery storage to eliminating single-use beverage containers from across campus. After the Trump administration part two came in, I wanted to take a more active stance, and MCEA and Minnesota, the right place to stand up, I think, to what's happening at the federal level. And so happy to be back in Minnesota working with a state that is not afraid to lead on the environmental issues, and grateful to be with you all. And the word I would say sums up session would be tied. A lot of the tie in the House really kind of solidified what was possible this year, and gave us a lot of, in some ways, certainty about the session.
Yeah, tied is a good one because, I think if you add up all the numbers, there's 101 Democrats and 100 Republicans in the legislature. If you combine the two bodies, and both bodies at some point were tied this
Right.
legislative session. And when this webinar was planned, we expected this legislature to be done, either completing their work by the regular end of session on May 19th, or to be doing some kind of quick special session to complete leftover bills. But here we are about 10 days later, and there's still no special session scheduled. Meanwhile, there have been these working groups that have been meeting in preparation for a special session. So I'm just going to start by turning this over, start with Ben. Where are we right now? And what should people know about the difference between a special session and a regular session?
Well, we're not in a special session and we're not in regular session. We're in the in-between land. And so there's not as many rules that govern this sort of in-between process. Yes, there's a commitment to working groups that that all the legislative leaders and the governor has, signed on upon this agreement that working groups are going to continue where the conference committees left off. But there's not a lot of structure. So you see the tax committee, they are meeting in public. Their meetings are interesting, to say the least. Not necessarily productive always, but interesting. But others are not meeting at all in public. And so it's definitely a difficult time period to try to track what's happening with proposals back and forth between the Senate and the House and the governor. As a reminder, only the governor can call a special session, so it does give him some leverage here. But he's going to wait till there's a detailed agreement on the outstanding budget areas, which I think is about 90% of the budget has not been decided. Everything from education, health and human services, transportation, environment, although we have a signed spreadsheet we can talk about, energy, which has not met ever publicly or in the conference committee process or since in this interim period. And then, of course, taxes, as I talked about, who are meeting, make up the vast majority of the budget and are not done. So any sort of deadline that they've tried to create, whether it was during the regular session or in the interim, they've kind of blown through. I think wasn't it supposed to be yesterday that was supposed to be special session? That was like the most recent one. Then we saw Jamie Long say Friday, but probably maybe more like next week. So June 1st, layoff notices go out to to state employees, sorry. And so that was another kind of deadline. Can we be done by June 1st so the state employees don't get a layoff notice for June 30th when the government shuts down? The last time, of course, that happened was 2011, and that was for about 20 days. So last thing I'll say is Senator Erin Murphy said this was one of the most difficult sessions ever. I agree. It was a brutal session. It was also one of the most unproductive. So, of the 6,600 bills introduced this session, only 39 have been presented to the governor at this point. So,
That's a great rundown. Thank you so much. Sarah, what else do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great summary, and I don't have a ton to add, but I do just want to highlight that one of the biggest differences I've seen between regular session and this interim period is the lack of transparency. So, as Ben said, only the tax working group has been meeting regularly in public to go over the respective bodies' offers. Whether that's successful is up for debate, maybe, but in regular session, the committees are meeting publicly to hear, discuss, and pass or lay over bills. And of course, there are some behind the scenes, discussions and negotiations going on, and there are real questions about the public's ability to meaningfully engage, even in those committee hearings. But they are much more open and accessible generally than what we've seen happening, or not, during this interim period.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny too, when yesterday the Jobs and Labor group met, and there was a lot of yelling about, well, I think there was really yelling actually about the fact that there hadn't been public meetings and a lot of the decisions were being made behind closed doors. There was even a meeting earlier, I think it was last week, where a reporter was invited to come into the room and then was kicked out by the members. So a lot of questions about transparency, and certainly the weird interim period that we're in right now is different, even more so difficult for folks to get a hold of what's happening there. Let's pivot a little bit to some of the bigger issues that came up this session related to the environment. I'm going to start with one that I didn't expect to be a big issue at the time, but became a huge issue, which is data centers. It's a new and big issue in Minnesota because of the number of new, what they're called hyperscale, you might call them mega-sized data centers that are being proposed for Minnesota. There's at least 10 that we're aware of that have been proposed across the state. And there's a lot of discussion about whether the benefits they would bring in terms of construction jobs primarily and tax revenue meets the significant environmental cost of water and climate and communities. Various bills related to data centers popped up throughout the session. Can you tell us where these 10 proposals stand, what bills, if any, might end up passing, and more importantly, how we feel about the position that Minnesota is in now to deal with data centers moving forward? We'll start with Sarah on this one.
Absolutely. So, yep, as you said, Erin, there's at least 10 data centers proposed for Minnesota. And as far as I know, the furthest along are the Meta facility down in Rosemont, and then the Tract facility in Farmington. I believe construction has started in Rosemont, but not in Farmington. And then there's also Amazon's proposed facility in Becker. So Amazon approached the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, in late 2024 for an exemption from what's called the Certificate of Need process for backup generation at that facility, but that request was rejected. So you may have seen last week that Amazon announced that they're pausing their plans, but we think this is really just an attempt to pressure the legislature into giving Amazon and other data centers generally what they want. For those other data centers, a lot of them have been hinted at in what are called alternative urban area-wide reviews, or AUARs, but a lot of the specifics are not known at this point. So that's kind of the update on where those facilities are. In terms of bills, nothing has passed yet, but a lot is still in play. So leadership has stated that the existing sales tax exemption for data centers should no longer include electricity. The work in progress tax bill includes that directive from leadership, but the Senate offer also extends the sales tax exemption on equipment and software, the other parts of that exemption, until as late as 2102. Currently, the sales tax exemption would only go through 2042, so a significant difference. The Senate offer also includes some pretty weak provisions for water and energy. For the most part, that language is very vague or pretty unenforceable. And it does not address how we can ensure that data centers don't cause Minnesota to miss our 100% carbon-free goals. The House offer in the tax working group only includes the leadership's directive on removing electricity from the sales tax exemption at this point. So given all that, I don't feel particularly great about Minnesota's positioning when it comes to data centers. I don't think we've moved further along in our collective understanding as a state of the impacts of hyperscale data centers, data center development, or the trade-offs we're being asked to make. What little information we do have suggests that these massive facilities could put an enormous strain on our water resources and energy system. And of course, local governments are understandably interested in property taxes that these facilities could provide, and the promises of hundreds or thousands of construction, but not operational jobs, is of course appealing. But at what cost? And will these facilities actually deliver on these promised economic benefits? Right now we don't have a comprehensive understanding of the issue or a framework that ensures we can protect our water resources, our electrical grid, our laborers, and our communities in general. I think we've been caught on the back foot this year, and we've got a lot of work to do, because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves stuck with a framework that data center developers and their proponents want, not one that's been built by and for Minnesota with our unique resources and needs in mind.
That's a good point. I mean, and I think there's also this other kind of overhanging issue, which is why there's an explosion of data center interest in Minnesota, particularly. And Minnesota is not, of course, the only place where data centers are being proposed, but the scale of what is being proposed here is really grown quickly, so quickly that I think it took a lot of people by surprise. Why is there so much interest in data center development, and what is it related to, Ben?
Well, I think Minnesota is a generous tax incentive state. I mean, I think you saw that the leadership agreement removing electricity, the exemption on electricity, probably right sizes the incentives, so that puts us more maybe in the middle of the pack as far as incentives. But with that exemption on electricity, all the equipment, that's we're just and with these AUAR processes, which essentially skip environmental review or use the AUR process as environmental review. I think it looks like an attractive place to quickly build a bunch of data centers without a lot of oversight. And I think the state is still trying to catch up to understanding that's the incentives that were created. And I just want to say these hyperscale data centers are so different from the traditional enterprise data centers. We're talking about facilities 25 times the size of a super target. And at least 10 of them proposed, and most of them in the South Metro. So this is something that we'll have to continue working on and following, and something that I think that every sort of state is waking up to. I think Senator Murphy said the data center issue captivated the legislature this year, and I think that's kind of right.
Yeah, I remember also like that early in the session, we were testifying that news about the DeepSeek AI model that came out of China broke. And that was the news in that day was basically, here's this new AI model that's going to use less electricity. And the utility stocks that day fell by 15 or 20% just because of so much speculation that was on that. But clearly AI is driving this conversation too.
Yeah, and I want to add a few things about artificial intelligence in general, because I think we're at the beginning of what's shaping up to be a big moment for humanity and democracy. I mean, first you see the big, beautiful bill at the federal level has a prohibition on states' ability to regulate AI for 10 years. That's in the bill that passed the House, and we'll see if it can make it through the Senate. But that's a real big red flag as Minnesota leaders look to regulate things like notification technology, eliminating the tax, sales tax on electricity. Is that part of, would that be part of regulating AI, or even a regulatory framework for data center development? So we could be looking at a matter of a week or two before Minnesota loses its ability to regulate AI at all. And so I think that's really important for people to understand. Second, obviously, some of the promises of AI are clearly a positive for humanity. AI is going to speed up drug discovery by probably, from 12 to 6 to 8 years. I can order a driverless taxi right now in Los Angeles or San Francisco. I can ask ChatGPT anything, and it will give me a definitive answer. So that's all cool. But some of the other applications are really anti-democratic, particularly when it comes to surveillance and the labor market. The problem for fascists and autocrats has always been that it's hard to monitor everyone. The dragnet just produces too much information. AI solves that problem by being able to create agents that can monitor everything in real time. And so I think you see some of these applications already in practice in China and other autocracies around the world. And Larry Ellison, one of the richest people and founder of Oracle, who's some are calling President Trump's AI czar, said recently, and I quote, "Citizens will be on their best behavior because we're constantly recording and reporting everything that's going on," end quote. But best by behavior according to who? So, yes, at the beginning of the year, AI used about 20% of existing data center capacity. And by the end of the year, it could be 40%. So, the fact that Minnesotans are being asked essentially to donate our fresh water from our aquifers to help build machines that could essentially be used to monitor us and eliminate our right to privacy should be really concerning, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. And then there's the labor market, where AI has automated everything from lawyers to doctors to communication professionals to manufacturers, the service industry. So many professions can be automated by AI. And so we should be focused on data center development in Minnesota. What are these companies asking from us? What are they building with AI? And what additional regulation and rules should we have in place before we authorize more capacity for them?
I mean, this is a really interesting issue, and probably the one. I mean, I thought it was particularly interesting that the new Pope Leo mentioned that the transformation of AI, the transformation of the economy and everything by AI is part of why he wanted to lead the Catholic Church at this time, which I think is really kind of telling about how big this issue really is. We're just kind of at the very opening part of it. Let's pivot to another issue that a lot of folks care about, sulfide mining or copper nickel mining. There were some efforts to weaken Minnesota's mining standards this session, and they were really kind of wild, I'll be honest. There was a lot of buzz in the media and elsewhere about President Trump and his attempts to roll back other mining protections at the federal level. And I want to spend a little bit of a moment here just kind of listing some of the federal actions that have happened. And to be clear, like we're helped along with this. We, folks like Friends of the Boundary Waters, Save the Boundary Waters, and others really track this more closely than we do. But here are just some of the few things that we're keeping track of. The Polymet, the mine that we worked on here at MCEA, has been added to the watch list for infrastructure projects eligible for expedited permitting, but that hasn't resulted in any substantive change yet. Other mining proposals elsewhere in the United States, like the Resolution Copper mine in Arizona, have been explicitly fast-tracked. Polymet has not been yet. Secondly, the big beautiful bill that Ben mentioned, big beautiful bill that Ben mentioned, there's a lot of B's there, passed the House. It included revoking the Boundary Waters mineral withdrawal and preventing court challenges to that reversal, but we'll see what remains after the Senate takes a look at it. And there's definitely concern about that provision and a lot of work trying to roll it back, get it out of that bill. Third, there have been a number of executive orders that purport to shorten environmental review to even less than a month. Catherine Hoffman, our CEO, was interviewed by the Timber Jay up in Ely about this question. She's like, how in the world can you do an environmental review in 28 days? And that's our same question. A lot of these are going to be challenged in court or already have been, and it remains to be seen what legal effect these will have. And the last and the most uncertain thing really is that the slashing of the federal workforce, both the EPA, the U.S. Forest Service, all the regulatory agencies that enforce federal environmental law, what has happened with the shrinking of those workforces by 20, 30, or 40% is that a lot of the work that they usually would do isn't going to get done. And what effect that will have on environmental law still remains to be seen. But also there's a state dimension to this. It wasn't just the federal laws that have been under attack. Also, we saw attacks at the state level too. So I want to turn it over to Ben and ask, what did we see at the state level, at the state legislature, particularly this year, in terms of attacks on state level mining protections?
Yeah, I think there were twofold. The first was the steelworkers unemployment benefits, which Representative Igo introduced a bill that would both give the steelworkers that were laid off from, I believe, two iron mines in northern Minnesota, their unemployment benefits, but then also would have undone the sulfide standard and reactive mine rule, the latter of which was part of the Polymet decision by the Supreme Court. And so those were linked together. And I would just want to give a shout out to Representative Pete Johnson of Duluth, who did an amazing job shepherding the clean version of the unemployment benefits through the process. And then the second would be permitting reform. This idea, this obsession, I would say, by the business community that permitting is too slow. And they've said from the beginning they didn't want to lower standards. And yet in the original bill, there was this separation between operations and construction permits, which would, if you're given, the ability to construct a mine or construct a power plant, but you don't quite have the operations permit yet, that puts a lot of political pressure, economic pressure on folks to give you that permit. And so we have been working on that all session long. And Erin, I think we'll hear from you on this about where we were at on permitting reform, because that's the part that it's a complicated set of proposals and ideas that has been around I mean, I think we'll probably be talking about permitting reform next year too, even if the chamber does get something this year from Walz and Senate Democrats.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more about that last part, because every year there's a new bill introduced to reduce, to reduce rigor in our environmental review and to reduce our standards on environment, always in the guise of what's called permitting reform. And we don't know for sure exactly what will happen this legislative session yet because of all the uncertainty we mentioned earlier, but we do have a pretty good idea about what's in the final environment bill based on both the spreadsheet that's been posted and also some of the information we've gathered. And so early in the session, there were really sweeping proposals to allow corporations that have their permits delayed to go to court to force them to make a quicker decision, to challenge the lack of a decision on a permit. A lot of these things, our attorneys were really concerned about, which was that, what would this do exactly? What would be the cause of action here? What would be the result of it? In any event, we know that environmental review and permitting does a good job of improving proposals and ensuring that they meet our standards. And so seeing attempts to treat permitting as though it's just a hurdle that needs to be overcome is really kind of flying in the face about why we have permitting laws and environmental review laws in the first place. And so one of the things we're always trying to remind folks at the legislature is why environmental review and permitting is good, what it does and how it protects communities. And these early proposals that were these big sweeping changes over the course of the session kind of fell away. There was, a lot of stuff that we were really concerned about. By the end, there were fewer issues that are of grave concern for us. All of this wasn't great, and none of it was improvements in how citizens and others can be protected by permitting laws. But the end result, apparently, is one bad proposal that's likely to make it through is to restrict petition signatures for an environmental review study to people who live in the county or the adjacent county to the proposal. Currently in Minnesota, if 100 Minnesota residents sign a petition and couple it with evidence that they submit to the Environmental Quality Board that a proposal risks the Environmental Quality Board can order an environmental study called an EAW. If this proposal, as we understand it, is going to pass, does become law, it means that you'd have to have that same evidence, but only the 100 signatures would have to come from the county or a county adjacent to it. Now, look, if this is an issue that's in Hennepin County, that's no big deal at all. But if it's in a really small county with 3,000 or 4,000 residents, 100 signatures can be a very difficult burden to overcome. And quite honestly, these are state standards, and pollution doesn't know county boundaries when they're talking about air or water pollution. So we're really concerned about that. We're glad to see some of the more extreme proposals otherwise dropped out, but we're really concerned that that will be one of the things that will survive that winnowing process and will change how we have to do our work in the future. I'm going to go on to some other stuff that we also know that we're under attack with the legislature this year too, which is Minnesota's environmental and climate work that we did during the trifecta years and these two signature achievements, the 100% carbon-free electricity law and the PFAS ban on non-essential goods, also called Amara's Law. And lastly, an environmental justice law that says that you can't add additional burden on top of already overburdened and overpolluted communities. I know that all of these were under attack in some fashion this legislative session. So I'm wondering if you could start by telling us what the efforts were made to weaken and also kind of protect these signature achievements that were made over the last couple of sessions. And I'll start with Sarah on this one.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, there were a lot of attempted rollbacks this year on 100% in particular. We saw bills that would have exempted rural electric cooperatives from complying with the law, would have created an automatic 3-year delay for any utility that couldn't meet the standards, the targets, or would have exempted out-of-state generating facilities from compliance. But the ideas that made it the furthest and appeared in the Senate Energy Omnibus in an early iteration were industry-specific carve-outs that would have allowed B100, which is pure biofuel, and woody biomass to be counted as carbon-free under the 100% law. So the rationale that I heard a lot for including them was that these are examples of clean energy that utilities should get credit for using. But clean energy is not the same as carbon-free energy, according to our law. The 100% law defines carbon-free as a technology that generates electricity without emitting carbon dioxide. B100 and woody biomass emit carbon dioxide or when combusted, so they can't meet the definition of carbon-free. These exemptions were kept in the Senate Energy Omnibus for a little while, despite attempts to remove them, because all the GOP members of that committee, plus Senators Frentz, Hoffman, and Klein, voted to maintain these provisions. But thankfully, when the bill arrived at its last stop in finance, a delete all amendment removed those and other bad policy provisions that we'll talk about later. The Senate Energy Omnibus, as Erin mentioned, is still very much in limbo. We don't know for sure where these policies might land, but the fact that they were removed and were not added back in on the Senate floor is a good sign. And I think a lot of that is due to advocacy from, regular people, but of course, orgs like MCEA and CURE as well.
Mhm.
And on cumulative impacts. So thankfully, no bad policies introduced, or at least none that saw the light of day in a committee to roll this back legislatively, but there are ongoing efforts in rulemaking happening.
Yeah. We haven't talked about PFAS yet. And so, Ben, I'm wondering if you could give us an update about what happened with Amara's law, the one that banned non-essential uses of PFAS forever chemicals. What was attempted and what do we know at this point?
Well, there's ongoing litigation. The cookware manufacturers have filed a suit saying that Minnesota has unfairly targeted out-of-state competitors. So we'll see about how that legal challenge goes. And then there was a bunch of other attempts, bills to roll back and give exemptions for certain industries, from cookware to children's ATVs, to airplane hangars. And so the MPCA did come out with some language to give them a little bit of flexibility on delaying implementation for certain products that we have begrudgingly agreed to. We definitely believe that any delays is better than permitted exemptions from the PFAS law. But overall, there remains some language in the Senate side of the Commerce bill that Senator Klein insisted on, that we will have to wait and see how that's resolved. But overall, any standalone attempts to, weaken Amara's law or add new holes to it were not completed by the legislature this year. And so the only remaining part of threat to Amara's law is that Commerce bill. And so we'd encourage folks who care about PFAS, these forever chemicals. We say they are forever chemicals. We'll be working on PFAS forever. And so please contact your legislator, call Governor Walz, and tell them that you want Amara's law to stay as it is.
Yeah, great advice. Now, I've seen a bunch of questions in the chat about specific issues, and I want to try to cover some significant amounts of ground in relatively short period of time. So I'm going to call this the lightning round. And I'm just going to try to toss individual issues that have either been things that MCEA sent action alerts out on, or you might have seen information from us about, and where it landed or what happened this session. And I'll send each one of these to one of our panelists. So I'm going to start with Ben. Helium and gas regulation, go.
Rulemaking from last year continues on. There was an attempt to create a regulatory framework in state law by Senator Hochschild that did not go anywhere in the House and did not complete its Senate journey. However, the tax portions are on the Senate side of the tax bill, but not any of this trying to authorize fracking or oil and gas development, which somehow snuck into the original version of the bill.
That's good news. All right, public waters. There was an attempt to roll back a public waters win, Sarah.
There sure was. That would have reverted us back to the old confusing system of how we define public waters. But thankfully, that did not prevail, which is great news. So we're back to what we were hoping for that passed, I think, last year or the year before now.
Yeah, and just to bring people up to speed, there's an existing and ongoing effort to update the public waters inventory with current science, and that will get kicked off this year, from what we understand from the Department of Natural Resources. Nitrate contamination of well water. Ben, we got something done last session. What happened this session?
Yeah, so in the supplemental budget year, MCEA did get a program off the ground with 1-year money to help with private well mitigation in southeastern Minnesota. This is something that our organization is dedicated to, nitrate contamination in the karst region of southeastern Minnesota. We did not get an appropriation from the agriculture budget this year because that was one-time money and it was appropriated last year. However, let's make sure let's look at the environment budget as well as it comes out next week. We may find something in there. And again, because money was appropriated last year, we will continue on this. This is going to be a project that we're working on as long as we're around. So,
and shout out to Representative Christy Purcell from
yes,
Northfield, who has been a real champion of this and continuing to push to try to get some more money for it. Fourth, e-waste, electronic waste collection and recycling. Sarah.
Yeah, we tried. We thought we got pretty close last year. Went into this year with some bipartisan support, thought we would make it across the finish line. But that quickly waned because industry kind of kept identifying new points of contention. So ultimately, we're at the point where it's very unlikely that it'll pass this year, which is unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. An issue that we've been involved with over several sessions, salt and chloride pollution of water, particularly liability reductions for applicators that agree to reduce their salt use. What happened with that, Ben?
Well, I think the definition of insanity is trying the same thing and expecting different results. I think the watershed districts and I and a bunch of other folks are going to take a beat here this spring, this summer and fall, and see if we can't come at this issue in a different way. So if you're interested in salt and watersheds and salt in water, send me an email. We're going to kind of do a reset on this issue in the interim.
Yeah, 1 teaspoon of salt permanently contaminates 5 gallons of water, and that problem is not going away.
Not going away. We just need a new strategy maybe for addressing the issue.
Yeah, for sure. How about wild rice? This is an issue that kind of broke later in the session, Sarah.
Yeah, so there was significant public support, great showing at a couple of the committee hearings. But despite that, some legislators really couldn't get over language in the bill that recognized wild rice's inherent right to exist and thrive. So the language was watered down in an attempted compromise, but ultimately, again, much like the e-waste bill, it's not likely to pass this year, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, that's true. Last year, the voters reauthorized what's called the Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund, which is the money that is set aside from the lottery profits to fund environment and natural resources projects. One addition to that, that was part of that, was what's called our community grants program, which is a much smaller grant program that doesn't require quite the level of lobbying and the amount of time in meetings, basically, so that smaller nonprofits that don't have lobbyists are more likely to access it. What happened with the community grants program, Ben?
Well, we're waiting to find out, but it is in the spreadsheet, the environment spreadsheet. We haven't seen language yet, but we are hearing that that program will be set up for at least the first year, and with a commitment to setting up funds for the next year. So we are hearing good things about that, and we'll report back explicitly how that program is set up as soon as the language of the environment bill is released.
Awesome. And last one in our lightning round, community solar gardens and solar net metering provisions. Sarah, this was a big fight in the Energy Committee throughout the session, both in the House and the Senate. What do we know about that?
It sure was, yes. So the Senate Energy Omnibus included language that would have ended the community solar garden program and weakened our net metering law. So there was significant pushback from net metering participants, solar developers, and environmental and energy advocates, which helped get the net metering provision removed from the bill. But unfortunately, the community solar garden sunset is still in that bill. But again, as we've talked about, the Senate Energy Omnibus is very much up in the air, so it's really hard to know if that provision is going to remain.
Yeah, we've heard things like "over my dead body"
Yes.
for the repeal of the community solar garden program. So we'll see whether that actually proves to be true or not. But so far, it looks like that fight continues.
Yeah.
Now I'm tired now, man. That was a lot of information. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the federal government again for a second, just because I think this was kind of one of the big overhangs on this session. You know, throughout the session, chaos is coming out of the federal administration, seemingly every day, on trade policy, on environmental rollbacks, et cetera. How did the DC dynamic impact the local political scene? How did it affect this Minnesota legislative session? What got done? What didn't get done? And then how do you think it'll continue to shape things over the next several years? I'm going to throw this to Sarah first, because I'm interested in what she has to say about it.
Yeah, so chaos in DC definitely influenced how our state legislators were thinking about their work this year. I had countless committee hearings. I can recall legislators, bringing something, whatever the latest news was, bringing it up. But one clear example I can think of that kind of something good coming out of it is the work done by our friends at the Citizens Utility Board in partnership with the Senate to add provisions to the Senate Energy Omnibus that would uncouple the state low-income energy assistance grants from the federal definition and requirements under the LIHEAP, which is Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. So that ensures that when LIHEAP funding goes away, folks in Minnesota aren't also left without state level assistance. And I think that's a really great example of the kind of work we should be doing over the next several years. We need to make sure that our state laws are adequately protecting the people in places in Minnesota that are increasingly under attack at the federal level. I think it's also important that in doing so, we're not just holding the line on our environment and climate goals. We need to continue to push for better environmental and community protections, greater public engagement, and more democratic and transparent systems at all levels of government.
Yeah, well said. Ben, you have anything to add about that?
No, I think that's really well said. The only thing I'll say is that, I think the Minnesota folks decided to get along in some ways. I don't know if there would have been more fighting if we wouldn't have had the chaos in DC. The House quickly agreed to a cut budget target just to have a conservative budget so that Minnesota could be prepared for whatever chaos is coming down from the federal level.
Yeah, and we heard a lot during the fiscal part of this session about the projections about the deficit that might be coming in the next couple of years, but there's a lot of uncertainty still left about what the impact of federal policy will be, especially trade policy, because Minnesota is really vulnerable to some of that stuff. So it is a kind of TBD, but it's interesting dynamic. And also one thing I'll just add here too is that the dynamics between the parties in St. Paul are not exactly what you see when you see them on television in DC. And that's kind of an interesting dynamic because I think in a lot of ways, Minnesota Republicans don't want to be tarred with the same brush some of their federal colleagues are, even though a lot of their policies are very similar. So it'll be an ongoing question, I think, about how the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in Minnesota try to either adapt to what's happening in DC or glom onto it, basically trying to ride along with their federal colleagues. All right, I've got one last question before we open up to Q&A. There's a lot of good questions in there. If you haven't already put your question in the Q&A, now's the time because we're going to go there next. But I want to make sure that we ask this question because it's important, which is, we're in this weird dynamic where there's an interim session and it's hard. They're not even meeting in public. What can the public do? I mean, how do you know that you're having an impact the way that you want to? And how would you suggest that folks reach out to their legislator or try to influence the results in this last gasp of this legislative session, especially when things are so opaque and difficult to access? And I'm wondering what you all think about that. I'm gonna start with Sarah and we'll go to Ben after that.
Yeah, I think the public can play a huge role in influencing the legislature. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, language that would have weakened our net metering law was removed. I feel confident because of the countless folks who provided written and in-person testimony or called or emailed their senators. On the other hand, we've had some very engaged members of the public weighing in on data centers, but those have continued to move forward. Why? I think that speaks to the power dynamics at play in the legislature that we can't ignore either. You've got plenty of organizations, corporations going, to the Capitol, and they've got decades of experience, deep pockets, literally dozens of lobbyists.
44.
And yeah.
44 tech lobbyists.
Yes. And strong legislative and state support. So I don't want to say, though, that means that public participation is a waste of time. It is absolutely essential that we are, public folks in the public are showing up and holding leaders and legislators accountable. And I think the best way to do that is always to call your legislator, ask to meet with them in person. Those are kind of generally seen as the best way to make sure your voice is heard. But emails, sign-on letters, responses to action alerts that our orgs or others send out are also great. You might not get a response right away or at all, but it is important that they're hearing from you. I've also seen folks who, of course, submit written or show up for in-person testimony or do letters to the editor. I think there's a lot of value in both of those if they're done well. But finally, just remind folks that it is extremely important to vote in every election. I know it can feel like your voice doesn't make a huge difference sometimes, but it does. I think this last election confirms that. We had multiple very close races in the state. So please vote.
Well said. Ben, what do you have to say about this?
Yes, I mean, all of that is great. We're coming up on primary elections as well. I always say if you're not voting in primary elections, you are not voting in the most important elections where you can really change the direction of your district. So get to know your legislator, vote in primaries, ask them questions about, how they think about data centers and AI. And if you don't like the answers, keep educating them. The Senate does have, every single one of the Minnesota senators will be up for re-election in the next cycle. And so, start paying attention to who your senator is and how they are on all these issues. And 3 o'clock today, we'll be at the Capitol, right, with Rise and Repair. So come down to the Capitol, get signed up, work with either MCEA or another group, volunteer. You'd be amazed at how much more you can do when you are in a group of folks who all care about something. So get
Yeah.
involved.
No, that's all really well said. And just another plug, at 3 p.m. today, there will be a mobilization that Rise and Repair Coalition is organizing outside the governor's office. I'll be there. A number of other folks will be there too. I think that's, at this point, being visible and being really clear about what you want from your leaders is really important because they haven't made these final decisions yet. And as long as they haven't been made, you still have a chance to influence them, and you should take that opportunity if you can. And one last thing I'll just add here is that, like, the more in person you can get with your legislator, the more influence you can have, right? So emails are great, and that's fine if that's what you can do. Phone calls are better, and in-person interactions with them is even better, right? So the more you can try to get in person with folks and tell them what you care about and why you care about it, the more likely they are to listen to you and have something to say about it. All right, this has been awesome, and we've got some really great questions in the chat that I want to get to. I'm going to start with a funny one, though, because it's not really a question, but it's hilarious. Friend of MCEA, Bob Tammon, says, I just received notice that Talon Metals will have their annual corporate meeting in Barbados. Is that in Minnesota? The answer is no, Bob. It is not in Minnesota. What Bob's referring to here, of course, is that Talon Metals, which is one of the companies looking and exploring for, in this case, nickel ore, near Tamarack, Minnesota, is headquartered in the British Virgin Islands as opposed to here in the United States, right? In the United States. And so there's always questions about who these folks are, these little tiny companies that don't exist anywhere except as a corporate PO box in some foreign land. Anyway, I thought that one was funny, so I'll just read it out loud. I want to go to a more serious question now, and this goes back to our panelists. What's an underreported environmental issue you'd like more eyes on? This person, Nick, asked what MCA isn't able to tackle. I would put this also for Kira, of course, but what are some issues that are out there that you think should be getting more attention at the legislature and elsewhere than they are? I don't know which one of you wants to take that one on first.
I mean, I will always say product stewardship. I think that e-waste, this is stuff that actually has been done in Europe and Canada and a lot of other places that we know works. So I just think the more people that can get involved in product stewardship, pushing these companies to agree to, have an end circular economy. I mean, that to me, that's something that we can all work on, and it's very common sense and it works all across the world. And so I'll always plug product stewardship.
Sarah, what do you think?
I think unsurprising to folks who know Cure or what I do in my time not at the legislature, I would say CO2 pipelines. There have been several proposed, generally in the Midwest, one for Minnesota currently. I think it still kind of seems like a far off thing or just a complicated issue that people don't want to give time to. Doesn't feel immediate yet, but it's definitely something we need to be talking about, especially in terms of safety.
Yeah, I would add one more to this because it's kind of a pet issue that I've become acquainted with through a variety of means, and it's huge, which is the water supply for the metro area.
Good one.
And we've got a patchwork quilt of all these individual cities, and some associations of cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul have water systems that serve multiple cities, but we don't have a comprehensive network of water supply for the entire metro area like we do for our sewer system, which feeds into a centralized system run by the Met Council. Ultimately, with droughts and climate change coming, it feels like this is a real issue that we've never really talked about and that no one really likes to talk about because it's expensive and invisible to a lot of people. They just turn on the tap and the water is there. But I think that in the next 15 to 20 years, if we don't come up with better solutions for a metro-wide water supply system, we may very well find ourselves regretting that we didn't take action when we knew that that was a problem. I wanted Mike ask a question in the chat about the 100% bill and particularly efforts to weaken the bill, but also efforts at the Public Utilities Commission to try to redefine what some of those terms mean. And I know, Sarah, you're really deeply involved in this. So any update on where the PUC is on the 100% rulemaking and some of the issues that have been brought up about life cycle analysis and biomass, for example?
Yes. So the Public Utilities Commission, it feels like it's been a long time now, but previously said that, we think that it's a much more complicated issue. It's not as simple as the definition would imply, whether it's, what counts as carbon free. So we're going to open up a separate docket to really kind of assess what kind of life cycle analysis do we want to do on certain things like biomass, or I'm trying to think of other things like waste to energy type of things, or carbon capture. And can a portion of that, based on the life cycle analysis, count towards a utility's carbon-free standard goals? So that is ongoing. I believe the first comment period for that docket is next week, even might be June 5th. Don't quote me on that, but it is soon. And then there will be a reply comment a little while after that. So that's an ongoing thing happening at the PUC. There's also these kind of stakeholder groups that are happening kind of to try and encourage some discussion around these topics of what might be considered carbon free, or what portion of something like biomass could be considered carbon free. But I have not been attending those myself. My colleague has been doing that for CURE.
Yeah, but it's good. It's good. It's a good reminder from Mike that these issues are not just popping up only at the legislature, but they also happen in regulatory agencies at the same time. And so it's part of the reason why the work that we do at MCEA is kind of like across all of these issues in the courts, at the regulatory agencies, and at the legislature, because they're all kind of feeding off of each other all at the same time. Julie up in Duluth asks about the city of Hermantown's agreements about data centers. You may have seen an article in the Star Tribune earlier this week about a proposal to build a data center in Hermantown, or at least they think it might be a data center, but no one can really tell because there's non-disclosure agreements. And she asked, is it legal for cities to sign non-disclosure agreements? I've been told that it was not, but this was an issue that popped up at the legislature this year, right, Ben?
Yeah, so there was a provision in the Senate state and local bill that would prohibit these non-disclosure agreements from being signed. The real question is whether or not they are following state law on what is required to disclose to the public. I think some people think that they're using some other federal law or some other standard that may not hold up in law. And Attorney General Keith Ellison is interested in this, and we've been in touch with his office. And so I think you'll see some data practices requests from these cities. And if they refuse to turn over information that we think is considered public, I think you'll see litigation on this front on the non-disclosure agreement area. And frankly, even some of the cities lobbyists think it's pretty poor practice. So I think the non-disclosure agreement is a big thing. I think we're at the beginning of unraveling what is legal and where the lines are on that.
Sarah, anything to add to that?
None. Thank
Well,
you.
I'll just add one quick thing, which was there was an attempt on the floor of the Senate to add a ban on non-disclosure agreements, and it failed on a 32-32 vote. So that's how close we're talking about here. We could have, I mean, I don't know what would have happened in the process following that, but that's how tightly divided everything is, even on issues that seem like pretty straightforward. I mean, for me, the idea that a city that's supposed to be doing environmental review of a proposal would also agree to shield certain information from the public when the whole point of environmental review is to disclose information to the public feels like a real conundrum, and one that I think a lot of local residents, especially the folks we've worked with down in Farmington, have really been highlighting about the non-disclosure agreements that have been signed between their city and proposed developer of a data center in their neighborhood.
Yeah, and it goes back to this idea, like, we don't know who the company is that is going to be using the data center. We don't know. They're claiming that the amount of water they use for cooling is a trade secret. The amount of electricity they use is a trade secret. I think all of those should be challenged by a court, and I would expect them to be.
That's great. All right, well, we're going to leave it there. And there were other questions in the chat we're not able to get to, and I apologize for that. But want to make sure that we give folks a timely end to this. And I want to thank, first of all, Sarah and Ben for providing their expertise. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today for it. And I also just want to remind you that, again, this work doesn't come for free, unfortunately. If you got information out of this session today that you thought was valuable, please make a donation. And you can sign up for our emails on our website. There'll be links in the chat that you can follow if you're interested. And lastly, join us if you're up for it, come up to the Capitol at 3 p.m. I mean, one of those things that feels really disempowering as a citizen is that there are secret things happening, but you can go there. And in fact, we do have a very accessible Capitol. Now, what happens there may not be very accessible, but you can be there, and we would love to see you there. So do take action. Join up with CURE, with MCEA, and anybody that's taking action at the legislature, because your voice matters, and it's really important for you to be involved at this time. So thank you so much again. This has been Legislative Breakdown. We didn't break down all the results as they're not fully known yet, but we really appreciate you being with us today and always taking action with us. So please continue to do so. And if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to answer your questions and try to do our best. So thanks again to Ben and Sarah. This has been MCEA's Legislative Breakdown webinar, and we appreciate you. Have a great day.